obviously, I follow Brazilian politics very closely. I've been involved in Brazilian politics as a journalist, and my husband was a member of the Brazilian Congress, so it's something that we follow very closely. Lived in Brazil for a while, and so it's something that is obviously a main focus of mine. I write for the country's largest newspaper, Folha of São Paulo, where I do a lot of reporting, but I really try not to talk about Brazilian politics per se on this show unless it really does have major international implications. We talked a lot about Brazil's really unequaled censorship scheme because of the way that jeopardizes free speech in the broader West. Every time one country in the democratic world goes further, it's a sign or a signal that other countries can as well. And there's a case now in the federal court that really does have major implications, not really for Brazil, but for the United States. Because the question is whether the Biden administration fabricated immigration documents in order to help Brazil's authoritarian censorship judge, Alexandre de Moraes, justify the baseless imprisonment of one of Jair Bolsonaro's top officials, his foreign policy advisor, Filipe Martins, whose imprisonment we've reported on before. Now, I just want to tell you a little bit about the case so you understand what the implications are for the United States. So this could genuinely be an explosive scandal if this is proven. I'm not saying it will be proven, but there's certainly a lot of grounds, as the federal court in the United States that's now looking into this has obviously concluded as well, to believe that something extremely strange, if not corrupt, happened here with American immigration records. Now, first of all, Filipe Martins was arrested in Brazil in February of 2024. Here you see the headline in Folha of São Paulo. At the time, it says the federal police targets Bolsonaro, Vladimir, former ministers and military officers in cooperation with a coup attempt. Targets include various people. And the key here is that Filipe Martins was never charged with a crime. He was being investigated for what Moraes says was his suspicion that Filipe Martins participated in a plan that would have led to a coup if Bolsonaro lost the election. That's the allegation against him. At the time, he was not charged. And yet, he was nonetheless ordered to be arrested by Alexandre de Moraes. Now, the interesting part about this was when Filipe Martins was arrested, the argument was that the reason he needed to be arrested, even though there were no charges pending against him, is because, said Moraes in the Brazilian court, Filipe Martins had left Brazil when Bolsonaro left Brazil. You may remember that Bolsonaro, right after the day before, the last day of his presidency, the day before Lula was to be inaugurated in 2022, left Brazil for the United States. He ended up staying in the United States in Orlando for 6 months, 3 months or 6 months, one of those, and then he came back. And the court said that this top advisor, Filipe Martins, went with him to the United States, entered the United States, but then he, in the words of the court, evaporated. He just disappeared because there was no record of him leaving the United States and coming back into Brazil, even though they knew he was in Brazil. So they said, look, this proves that he can just disappear, like he's like the invisible man. And that shows that he can flee justice at any time. So we have to put him in prison while this investigation is ongoing because of what he did. He left Brazil, entered the United States, but somehow came back without leaving a trace of having done so. The whole thing was a lie, an absolute, provable, demonstrable lie. I spent months working on this case, and there was a mountain of evidence proving that Filipe Martins never left Brazil. He was in Brazil the whole time. He just never went with Bolsonaro to the US. None of this ever happened. Just to give you a couple of examples, a week after he was alleged to have gone to the US with Bolsonaro, Filipe Martins flew on a domestic flight inside Brazil. And the court got those records. It was a Brazilian Airlines. He flew from one city in Brazil to the other a week after he was said to have gone to the United States. So just on that alone, they knew he was in Brazil. They had iFood receipts and credit card charges, his phone records, mountains of surveillance data that the federal police obtained, showing that he was in Brazil the whole time. There you see from Wall, one of the Brazilian outlets, while he was in prison, Filipe Martin presents iFood receipts and airline ticket in order to argue that his imprisonment should be overturned. And the fact that this was such a lie from the start was incredibly obvious. I mean, I would not have written an article arguing that he was wrongfully imprisoned unless I was truly convinced with certainty that he was in Brazil all along. And I saw this evidence. I worked with his lawyer, and I ended up writing this article. This was in August of 2024. So basically 6 months into his imprisonment, I wrote an article in Folha. There you see it in Portuguese, but the headline of that translated is Bolsonaro's former advisor is imprisoned based on a false allegation. Alexandre de Moraes ignores evidence proving that Filipe Martins did not try to flee Brazil at the end of 2022. And what was amazing about this was that the evidence was so immediately apparent that Filipe Martins never left Brazil and came to the United States, that even his prosecutors, who are part of the government under Lula da Silva, even they, right after he was imprisoned and then again in May, went to the Supreme Court and said, look, we don't think he should be in prison. We realize now there's no evidence that justifies this allegation that he left Brazil and evaporated. He was in Brazil the whole time. Even his own prosecutors were arguing that. And Moraes twice ignored them and just rejected that petition to release him. And here you see from CNN Brazil, May of 2024, Moraes rejects a new request for release and keeps Filipe Martins in prison. The prosecutor has already spoken out in favor of the release of Bolsonaro's former advisor. Quote, the arrest was based on the argument that Filipe Martins left Brazil aboard a presidential plane on December 30th, 2022 with then President Jair Bolsonaro. The Attorney General's office has already expressed itself for the release of Martins on March 1st, a month into his imprisonment. In the most recent motion submitted on April 23rd, the defense indicated what it considers a new and relevant piece of evidence to prove that Filipe Martins did not, in fact, leave the country on the presidential plane that departed Brasilia for the United States on December 30th, 2022. It is a response from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, part of the Department of Homeland Security, the agency responsible for the entry of foreigners into the United States, to a request from the defense regarding Martins' entry and records into the country. The U.S. agency stated its system contains no record of Martins entering Orlando on December 30th, 2022, the date when Bolsonaro and his entourage landed in the country. It also confirmed that his last recorded entry in the U.S. was in September of 2022 via New York. So he never even entered the U.S. until 2 months before they claim he did, and then he came back. He just never went to the U.S., and the evidence was overwhelming in this regard. Here is the headline where the prosecutors again went back in August, which is when I wrote my article, saying, again, the prosecutors, the Attorney General office, request his release precisely because there was no evidence. And all the evidence that was available disproved Moraes' argument that he disappeared and therefore had to be in prison. He kept him in prison for 6 months. The reason they wanted him in prison, and they've done this many times before, they imprison people and they say, you're not going to get out unless you start turning on Bolsonaro and his top aides. And if you admit that they actually did a coup and you participated in it, we'll let you out. But if you don't, we're going to keep you in prison. So even knowing the whole imprisonment was based on a false accusation, they kept him in prison anyway. Now, what the key event here that happened is after all that evidence was demonstrated that he never left Brazil, and after the Customs and Border Patrol said we have no record of him entering Brazil, suddenly, in the middle of his imprisonment, somehow in the Customs and Border Patrol system, there was created, or there emerged, out of nowhere, a record that, contrary to what they had said previously, now said, oh yeah, we actually do have a entry record in our system for Filipe Martins. And that was when Moraes said, oh, look, even now the Border Protection Agency in the U.S. says, yes, he did enter the U.S., but that he actually never left. It got manufactured out of nowhere. And then Moraes used that to justify it. Here's the U.S. Customs and Border protection record, the first one that was produced, that appeared in the middle of all this. This is the Customs and Border Protection Agency under Joe Biden. And here they purport to have the most recent entry date into the United States of December 30th, 2022. That's when that presidential pain with Bolsonaro came to the United States. Suddenly they had, they're like, oh no, we do have a record of him entering the United States on exactly that date. And then Rice said, oh look, he got some reporter extremely close to the Supreme Court that serves as their spokesman, especially Reich, published an article, oh, there is now an immigration record showing that he entered the US and evaporated, even though before there wasn't. And this record was so bizarre, not just because it appeared out of nowhere, but because it had so many mistakes in it. For example, it misspelled his first name. There you see the American spelling of Filipe, F-E-L-I-P-E. His name is actually F-I-L-I-P-E, so they misspelled his name. They also had here a passport number that was actually an old passport number right here. This was an invalid passport from years before that he hadn't used. And also it had him entering on a type of visa that he never had and never used. It's like 3 very clear mistakes on this document that appeared out of nowhere. Then once they started interrogating and saying, well, what is this document? Where did it come from? How did you get that? They started kind of backtracking. And what they did was, first, they took all 3 of those errors that Filipe Martin's lawyer said, how can this be a real record? It has 3 errors. And they just quietly changed it retroactively in the system. So now they spelled his name correctly. They changed the document number to reflect his document number and changed the type of visa they said he entered on. They just retroactively changed the immigration records quietly with no note that they had done so. And then as more pressure was put on them saying, what is all this? They finally changed the record to reflect the reality, which was that his most recent entry into the United States was actually in September of 2022. So 2 months before that Bolsonaro plane went. He clearly was not on it. They had his name right, his passport right. But you see, they eliminated that record saying that he entered at the end of December, which is what the whole basis was for his imprisonment. Why were these immigration records in Customs and Border in the United States trifled with, played with, and potentially fabricated at exactly the time that Moraes needed some evidence to keep him in prison? One thing I can tell you is there are a lot of Brazilians who work in the United States, who live in the United States, who have become citizens of the United States, but obviously pay a lot of attention to Brazilian politics. And there's a lot of them who work there. I know Martin's lawyer one time called the Orlando Customs and Border Patrol where this came from, and they ended up speaking to the person who was responsible or overseeing this, and he had a clear Brazilian or Portuguese accent in English. So there's a lot of mystery here. And not just mystery, but a lot of basis for suspicion. Obviously, if someone's going in, if the Customs Border Patrol can go in and start manipulating immigration records or changing them or just erasing data, that's a huge national security threat. These are the records that tells us who comes into the country, when they come in. And if somebody committed immigration fraud of this kind, if somebody created fabricated records in this system for purely political reasons to help keep a Bolsonaro advisor, who the Biden administration obviously hated, lots of people hate the Bolsonaro movement, all to help this Judge Moraes, unjustly keep someone in prison. And that's something people should go to prison for in the United States. That's forgery, that's fraud. Here from Folha of Sao Paulo too, as the investigation went on, as he was in prison, just more evidence. July of 2024, cell phone data shows that Martin was in Brazil during Bolsonaro's stay in the US. Information by TIM, which is the big cell phone carrier in Brazil, to the Supreme Federal Court proves he did not travel with the former president. And they knew this very close to the beginning. In fact, right after Lula was inaugurated, right, just a couple weeks after Filipe Martins supposedly went to the US with Bolsonaro and then disappeared, they submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, the equivalent of that, to the government, which by this point was run by Lula. And they said, request for information about the flight to Miami that transported the former president of the Republic, Jair Bolsonaro, among others. And the government said the official delegation on the plane was composed of, and they list the people, former President Jair Bolsonaro, his wife, the former First Lady, and you just go through that list, and Filipe Martins is not on it. This was available a year before Moraes ordered him imprisoned. He just wasn't on the plane. He never was on the plane. He never left Brazil. So now what has happened is they have filed a lawsuit, if we can pull that up. Filipe Martins and his lawyers filed a lawsuit in the Federal District Court in Orlando. There you see the lawsuit in the Middle District of Florida, Filipe Martins against the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the United States Customs and Border Protection, raising all these issues, showing the federal court, look, there's good reason to believe that something very untoward happened here. And we want discovery to find out how this false document emerged in the middle of his imprisonment, right when the prosecutors were saying, release him, all the evidence proves he never left Brazil. He was in Brazil the whole time. Conclusive, decisive evidence, and then suddenly this thing appears in the middle of the Customs Border Patrol system when previously they had no record of him entering. And then that became the foundation, the basis for keeping him in prison. Here was that reporter who serves the agenda of the Supreme Court, who published several false articles, one of which had to be heavily retracted about how he left the United States. It's from Metropolis. His name is Guilherme Armado. And there you see the title, which is Under Investigation, Filipe Martins has a recorded entry in the United States and then vanished. A document on a U.S. government website states that Filipe Martins entered Orlando at the end of 2022. Again, this is June. This is 4 months after he was first ordered in prison, or 5 months. This is the article that appeals under a journalist well known to be aligned with Moraes, who's basically his spokesman. And he's like, oh, look what I found. A Customs and Border record, a new one. A year into this whole thing. That now suddenly shows, oh no, he did actually enter the U.S. And then they had to retract it. They say, quote, the first version of the headline for this article was, under investigation, Bolsonaro's former advisor went to Orlando in 2022 and vanished. This column understood, based on information available from the public consultation of Filipe Martins' I-94 entry form, that Martins had traveled to Orlando on December 30th, 2022. At the time, the column made extensive efforts to contact Martins, but he never responded. Months later, Martins provided information to the Supreme Court showing that he was in Brazil on that date, which suggests that the U.S. government website contained incorrect information. They even had to admit it, the people who were desperate to keep him in prison, because it was so provably false. So even this reporter who found this record and said, oh, look, this proves he evaporated, came to the U.S. and evaporated, now had to go back and retract the entire story, saying that, quote, the U.S. government website contained incorrect information. Though we have never received a response from Martins' lawyers, in the interest of accuracy, the column made this correction. We understand it was necessary because as of the publication date of this text, based on the I-94 data, the most accurate statement would have only been that there was a received entry, not that he had, in fact, traveled to the United States. I mean, this is, regardless of why this happened, this is a massive scandal, because you cannot have radically incorrect information in the U.S. Customs and Border system about entry into the United States. Again, it's a huge national security problem. That is the border. That's what's supposed to keep out people, to tell the United States government who enters. And I guess it's possible sometimes mistakes get made in bureaucracies, but this would be an extremely coincidental mistake. That exactly at the time when the Supreme Court judge, Moraes, knew that Filipe Martins had never left Brazil, that all this information that he long had even before he ordered Martins in prison, including federal police surveillance, all kinds of receipts showing that he was in Brazil the whole time. It was dispositive. Even the prosecutors admitted, suddenly at the exact right time, this Customs and Border Protection form in the United States emerges in their system, showing exactly what Moraes needed it to show in order to justify his ongoing imprisonment. And it is, really remarkable. The whole case is remarkable. The involvement of the United States is remarkable. Whether there was evidence to believe that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection participated corruptly in these events or just recklessly, either way, this should be a matter of great interest to the U.S. Congress, to American policymakers, to investigators. Now, fortunately, we have this judge in the United States who, as I said, is a Clinton-appointed judge, but clearly based on his commentary thus far on this lawsuit, it's only pending for a short amount of time. But he's already shown at least some degree of sympathy, some degree of concern about what really happened here. Here's Foley on April 2nd of this year reporting on the court case in the U.S. Quote, U.S. court schedules a hearing in the case alleging fraud in the entry of Bolsonaro's former advisor into the country. Filipe Martins, one of those indicted by Brazil's Attorney General's office, will be heard on April 9th in Orlando. Quote, the hearing will aim to clarify what the former advisor's defense sees as signs of fraud in the U.S. immigration records. The records appeared in April 2024 during his imprisonment and were deleted in July of the same year. I just want to stress, this newspaper, this is where I work, they are not pro-Bolsonaro, to put it mildly. It's like the New York Times of Brazil. I personally consider them to be the most journalistically fair mainstream outlet in Brazil. That's why I worked with them. I've worked with them for many years. I did a little bit of Snowden reporting with them as it pertained to Brazil. I did the investigation of the anti-corruption probe in Brazil this past year when I got the archive from Moraes' chambers, along with a reporter there. They very aggressively publish every story on the front page, even though Moraes is a sacred figure in Brazil. They're not supposed to criticize him. I really respect the editors of this paper, but they are still pro-Bolsonaro, anti-Bolsonaro editorially. And this is what they're saying as a news article, that suddenly it appeared in April, right when he was in prison, they needed it, and then was deleted in July of the same year. And then Moraes released him in August, 2 weeks after my article, when it became clear that this was a scam. It goes on, quote, the former advisor to Bolsonaro is one of the individuals indicted in the alleged coup plot said to have been orchestrated by Jair Bolsonaro. According to a statement by Judge Gregory Presnell, Martins may attend the session either in person or remotely. And then after that article, the judge actually authorized discovery to take place. Martins' lawyers have a right to request multiple documents relevant to understanding how this false immigration entry emerged right when it was politically convenient and necessary to do so. And so discovery is going to take place. I believe they have the right to depose officials at the Customs and Border Patrol as well to determine whether or not there was actual immigration fraud for political reasons, to keep someone unjustly in prison who was disliked by the United States government. And I just want to underscore what an absolute tyrant and authoritarian Alexandre de Moraes is. Just want to underscore this for you. After this lawsuit was filed, and he knows that his reasons for keeping Filipe Martins in prison have now been completely disproven. He kept someone in prison for 6 months who had not been charged with a crime. He now has been, just a couple months ago, he was part of the indictment along with Bolsonaro of trying to engineer a coup. I don't think it's actually been formally accepted yet by the court, so he's not formally a defendant, but at the time he hadn't been charged with anything. It was just an investigation. And Moraes knows that he put someone in prison for 6 months despite the foundation and justification and rationale for that imprisonment having been completely debunked. And And so now Filipe Martins is suing in a U.S. district court. And so a week after that lawsuit was filed, Moraes threatened Filipe Martins with return to prison. When he released Filipe Martins from prison, because there was no evidence to justify his being there, he imposed obviously unconstitutional conditions that he's not allowed to use social media, he's not allowed to publicly talk about his case. In other words, he can't criticize Martins. See, that's a condition for the release. 4 months ago, or 5 months ago, in October of last year, Filipe Martins' lawyer came out of the courthouse and made a statement to the press while Filipe Martins stood next to him. He didn't speak, Filipe Martins, only his lawyer did. And so Moraes, obviously vindictively, in response to this embarrassing lawsuit, issued an order saying, you have 24 hours to justify why your lawyer posted this video or recorded this video when there was a order for you not to speak. And if you don't justify it to my satisfaction, you're going back to prison. I'll put you back in prison. That's the kind of maniacal authoritarianism that we have, that Brazil has. But I do want to emphasize, I just hope people understand the consequences, and I hope people in Congress start to take this very seriously, that there was absolute trifling with the immigration system and the immigration records of the United States. Whether it was done recklessly in a huge coincidence or corruptly, knowing that it was necessary to keep Filipe Martins in prison, is something that this lawsuit ought to find out. But obviously it should be a huge concern to the Republican-controlled House and Senate to find out whether or not people are just entering the Customs and Border system, the immigration system, and just playing with documents, fabricating documents, erasing them, deleting them, just willy-nilly because of what they hope to achieve by doing that. Certainly the answers are going to be discovered in this court case, but I think the Congress ought to be looking very seriously at this well, since it affects the integrity of the American immigration system, the entrance system in the United States, and therefore, obviously, lots of implications for national security as well.